Hey everybody, welcome back to this week's continued exploration of the story. We are into chapter 5 entitled New Commands and a New Covenant. The setting for chapter 5 is in the wilderness of Sinai, which the wilderness of Sinai, if you look at some maps, considered to be kind of the majority of the Sinai Peninsula, or at least the southern portion, kind of down where it tapers down to a point. That is where it's at, and almost entirely, just about the entirety of this chapter, other than a few throwaway uh, sentences at the beginning, is at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is also known as Mount Horeb or Mount Oreb in some different portions of Scripture. And we hear right away that the people, and by the people I mean the Hebrews or the Israelites who have left Egypt, it's about 3 months after they've left Egypt. So they've sort of been wandering in this initial period of just kind of making their way past the Red Sea. Of course, we heard about that last time, and then beginning to move around within what's thought to be the Sinai Peninsula. And they get to the mountain, as we already mentioned, and they're camped out there for pretty much a year. They just sort of set up their tents and they set up their camp, and they are there at the base of Mount Sinai for the better part of a year, just short of a year. This particular chapter encompasses portions of Exodus, kind of like the back portion of Exodus or the last portion of Exodus, and then moving through a lot of Leviticus. A lot of what we hear comes out of there. Preview, next week we will move through Numbers and Deuteronomy, finishing out what is known as the Pentateuch, or the 5 books. The first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures make up what is also called the Pentateuch. So we're moving through that. That's kind of where we're at. This week, we've kind of got 3 main portions within our narrative of what's going on. We have God giving the commandments and the law, if we want to call it that, to the people through Moses. That's the initial thing. Then we have what can best be described as a rebellion of the people, aka the people not following the law, and then God renewing the covenant as they prepare to move forward. So that's kind of the 3 main things. Now, in the initial introductory portion of this chapter, we hear God's calling, maybe, or promise, maybe. We call a lot of different things, but God's idea of God's location being holy. Sorry, my brain was kind of going 2 different directions there. God and the location really being the mountain initially, but then also we'll see the tent of meeting, aka the tabernacle, later on. So where God is holy and set apart, even borderline dangerous. We essentially hear that Moses is the only person who's allowed to come up the mountain, although it does seem we have a couple of exceptions, that at one point Aaron, and then at another point Joshua, his assistant, seem like they're with him too. But mainly it's just Moses or just the initial immediate leadership that are allowed to approach. The people have to consecrate themselves to even come close to the base of the mountain, and to touch the mountain risks death. So, this is kind of a big deal. Here's the thing about the mountain that I think is interesting. It's described as being covered with a cloud. Sometimes there's fire. Sometimes it quakes. And I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like a volcano to me. And I'm not the only person who has ever postulated that as a possibility. There are some theories out there. However, it gets a little ambiguous because there's no evidence of volcanoes in that region, in the Sinai Peninsula in particular. Although there are some in the northern part of Arabia if you go a little bit farther east and kind of move on through into the next region that's out there. So some different theories are that it was not a volcano, or that the wilderness wanderings maybe have taken them farther than Sinai, and just records are weird, or stories are weird. And, sometimes it's like that. But these are just theories. We don't really know one way or the other. It's thought that Mount Sinai is kind of down in the southern portion of the Sinai Peninsula. But again, we don't know. There's a traditional spot from some of the information that I found that they think that this is what is thought to be Mount Sinai, but we don't really know what mountain is Mount Sinai. All of that is to say, Mount Sinai, they're there. We don't know exactly where it's at. While they're there, God makes a promise. God makes a covenant with the people, which I think really kind of echoes the promises that we began to hear in the earlier part of Exodus when they're still in Egypt. God's promises to be with the people, that they will be God's people. Um, what I really like about this is that God says to them, "You will be a priestly nation," or depending on the translation, sometimes we hear a kingdom of priests. Kind of means the same thing, just some slightly different ways of saying it. And it raises the question, what do priests do? What's the function of a priest? Well, a function of the priest, in my opinion, is to talk about or point people towards God. And if that's the case, well, then their entire nation is supposed to point people towards God. How's that going to work? Well, they're going to be an example, hopefully, that's the idea anyway, through the following of the Ten Commandments and the law that is given through Moses. And by living their lives in that way, they're going to show by example how to live in harmony with God and how to live in harmony with one another. Now, we get the Ten Commandments, and they're listed out in there. Here's the funny thing about the Ten Commandments. They actually show up a couple different times. And depending on your tradition, we number them ever so slightly differently. In our reckoning, the way we kind of teach it and look at it, and I'm thinking about this because we're starting the Ten Commandments in confirmation today. That's a side note. But 1 through 3 are aimed at our relationship with God, and then 4 through 10 are aimed at our relationship with one another. And again, in the other reckoning, that's ever so slightly differently, but that's essentially what they are. Now, this is what is given to the people through Moses. And all of this is happening up on the mountain during this long period. Moses has kind of gone up and down and up and down and up and down. And now he's been up there for a long time. They say it's like 40 days, so like more than a month, pushing 6 weeks. He's been gone for a long time. And up in the cloud, and who knows what's going on up there, and the people don't know where they are. So the people begin to rebel. We don't know where he's at. He's probably dead. Aaron, we need to be able to see the God who brought us out of Egypt. Therefore, you need to make us an idol. Weird, right? But that's what happens. Literally, as Moses is receiving the commandments, the people are down the mountain breaking the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. And I think that's funny and sad all at the same time. It's really telling of human nature, how quickly we tend to do things of that nature. But God knows what's going on down the mountain. God basically says, you know what? These people, I'm going to wipe them out, and I'm going to start over with you, Moses. That might sound familiar. We heard the same sort of thing with Noah, and we will hear it other times as well. But Moses, not really knowing what's happening down there, talks God out of it. This is interesting. I often kind of wonder, did they like sit down in a courtroom and have a debate to figure this stuff out? And of course, the answer to that is no. But Moses reminds God of the promises that God had made. Moses clings to those promises on behalf of the people. Yay, Moses. Thank you, Moses, despite what's going on down there. However, Moses goes down the mountain then, carrying the tablets of the commandments that he has received. He sees how bad it is. He loses his mind, breaks the idol, grinds it up, this golden calf, breaks the commandment tablets, grinds them up, puts them in the water, makes people drink it. A bunch of people get a plague and they die. Not everyone, but a bunch of them do. And we see the breaking of the commandments there. And now here's what's interesting. Think about this. It was the people that were breaking them. Moses had received them, but Moses literally broke the commandments, or literally destroyed the commandments, if we want to think about that. That will come into play here in just a second. Moving on from here, God does forgive the people. Now, there's some angst, there's some turmoil that goes on there, but God forgives the people and reestablishes the covenant. You will be my people. I will be with you wherever you go. I will dwell in your midst, and not just here on the mountain, but I will dwell among you. Now, Moses has received the instructions for this tent of meeting, also known as the tabernacle, and we skip over the actual construction of it. That's a big portion of the scripture that we don't have in here. But that is created, and it is intended to be the dwelling place of God. And God will dwell within the tent as either a pillar of cloud or a pillar of fire, hopefully just cloud, because fire sounds like it would burn up the tabernacle. But God dwells there in the midst of the people. And we hear that Moses is able to go in and out, and they are able to communicate. Now, here's one little thing that I think is funny. We have a passage, and it was listed in here, that God covers the face of Moses to basically say, you can look at my back. And there's difference of translations here, but the best understanding that I've had of that is not so much you can look at my back, but it's I will cover your face, and then you can look at the place where I was. Essentially, you can look behind me to see my glory from where I was, because you cannot handle to look upon me. But Moses, as we hear, also gets all glowy when he's in the presence of God, which that's a whole different situation. But Moses and God seem to be the collaborators here, and God has promised to be with the people and dwell among them. Now, again, remember, in this chapter, they have stayed put at Mount Sinai, and they've been there for a year. As things pick up in the next chapter, they leave Mount Sinai, and we begin to get into more of the extended wanderings. That's a preview of next week. But even through that period, God still dwells among them. When the cloud of God's presence rests on the tabernacle, the people stay put. When it moves, then the people pack up and they move. So that's sort of a preview of God's promises there. I went through a lot there. I want to try and wrap this up before this gets any lengthier than it already has. But a few thoughts. This is something that I'm going to continue to do, just really pointing out some of the things that kind of make you go, I've used the word problematic before, but just things that I kind of scratch my head at a little bit that I think are worth considering. God's intention for the Hebrew culture, as we hear, is to be this nation of priests. And that seems to be a good thing. And honestly, I think it is a good thing. We might be able to connect that with the original promise God made to Abraham way back when, and before that all nations of the world will be blessed through you as they see you as an example. However, that which God, I think, intends for good doesn't always end up that way. And human nature, whatever, tends to get in the way of that. I think, this is the brokenness of reality that we've talked about many different times, and that I continue to talk about, that I think Jesus ultimately would redeem, but that's getting way ahead of ourselves. I think that this can get twisted in the belief that when we talk about the law, of this is what you must do. Like, you have to earn it. You have to earn salvation. You have to earn God's favor. And honestly, within this covenant language that we've had, there's a little bit of that sense there. I don't deny that, but in our Lutheran understanding of that we do not earn our salvation, I get a little twitchy at that. So that's just one thing to point out. But at another level, I think there's also a danger when we start thinking about this idea of anyone being God's chosen people. Now, again, I don't deny that's what the scripture says. That the scripture says that God has claimed the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, the Jewish people as God's chosen people. And that in itself is a good thing. However, whenever somebody starts saying that we are the favorites and it's not for anyone else, we get a little bit of arrogance, we get a little bit of abuse of foreigners, a little bit of entitlement, maybe even some downright racism, and that could be problematic. Now, let me be clear, having said that, having listened to it just come out of my mouth, I am not trying to insinuate that the Jewish culture or the Israelite culture or the Hebrew culture is bad. I am not trying to be anti-Semitic here. My opinion is that whenever anyone starts to say, and I'm going to include us Christians in it because we're really good at this too, whenever we start to say we got it all figured out and we're the favorites and we're the good ones, well, that's problematic. So where I'll leave this is the idea of as the people make it eventually to the Canaan or the Promised Land or whatever we want to call it, there's people that already live there. And things don't go well for those people who already live there. And there's some tension in there too. But I posed this last week with the Egyptians that all of humanity is beloved of God. So these ones that are challenged and eventually killed through various cultural wars and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what do we do with that? Not posing any answers. I just hope that you think about that. This got a little bit longer than I'd hoped, but thanks for another good one. Take care, everybody.